The tape stopped, not because anyone pressed a button, not because the reel ran out. The engineer, a man named Gerald who had spent 11 years in that studio on Santa Monica Boulevard, reached over and killed the playback himself. He did it quietly, the way you close a door when someone is sleeping, because the air in that room had shifted, and everyone felt it, and no one wanted to be the one who broke the silence first. Michael Jackson was standing in the vocal booth with his headphones around his neck, one hand on the microphone stand, eyes already on the glass before the tape even stopped. He had known it was coming. He had felt Quincy watching him differently for the last 40 minutes. Not the focused, forward-leaning attention of a producer chasing a sound, but the stiller, heavier attention of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the right time to say it out loud. That feeling, the dread of a conversation that hasn't started yet, was one Michael had grown up with. It lived in the space between his father's footsteps on the stairs and the opening of the rehearsal room door. It lived in the 3 seconds of silence before Joseph Jackson told you what you had done wrong. Michael was 19 years old and had spent most of those years learning to read a room before anyone spoke, because in his experience, by the time someone actually said the words, it was already too late to prepare yourself. So he was already braced when Quincy pressed the intercom and said, "Come out here for a second." This was October 1978. The sessions for what would become Off the Wall had been running for 6 weeks at Westlake Audio, a studio with wood-paneled walls and a mixing console so wide it took 2 people to reach both ends. Tucked on a stretch of Santa Monica Boulevard, where the smell of jasmine came through the ventilation at night and mixed with the cigarette smoke and the cold coffee and the particular close smell of a room where people had been working too long. Michael had been here every day. Sometimes he arrived before the engineers, but in 6 weeks, something between him and Quincy had remained unresolved. A gap Quincy could hear and Michael could feel, and neither of them had found the right words for yet. He had been doing that since he was 12. The cassette recorder on the nightstand, songs that came at 2 and 3 in the morning, the careful way he had of protecting them from his father's schedule and the Motown machinery that had owned his voice since he was old enough to stand at a microphone. The songs were entirely his. No one could take the unrecorded ones, but getting them from his head to tape, intact, without the walls going up, that problem he had not yet solved. Quincy pulled out the chair across from the console and sat down. He set his legal pad on the table, read what he had written, then turned it face down. The 2 session musicians who had been in the room gathered their jackets without being asked. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded, in the silence that followed, much louder than it was. "You know what I heard tonight?" Quincy said. Michael said nothing. "I heard a kid who is afraid to be a man." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Gerald, at the far end of the console, did not move. He would later say that in 11 years of recording sessions he had heard producers say hard things to artists, had watched singers cry, watched musicians pack up their instruments and leave without a word, and that what happened in that room that night was different from all of it. Not because of what was said, because of the silence that came after it, and what went into that silence and what came out the other side. "Every song you brought me," Quincy continued, "every track, every demo, it's good. I want you to hear me say that. It is genuinely good. But good is not what we're here for. Good is what you put out with your brothers. Good is what Berry Gordy gets in the morning mail from every 20-year-old in Detroit who thinks he can sing." He leaned forward. "I asked you to come out here and make a record that nobody has ever heard before. And every time you get close to it, every time I can hear you getting close, you pull back. You go back to the voice you know, the safe one, the one that already worked." Michael's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. Here is the thing about Michael Jackson at 19 that almost nobody understood at the time. The voice that Quincy was calling safe had taken him nearly a decade to build. It was not laziness, it was architecture. Every controlled run, every placed note, every technically correct performance was a wall he had constructed brick by brick against the memory of a father who stopped rehearsals to tell him what he was doing wrong in front of his brothers, against the years of tours and recording sessions where good enough for the label was the ceiling and nobody asked what he heard in his head at 3 in the morning. The safe voice was not a limitation, it was armor, and Quincy Jones was sitting across the table telling him to take it off. "I'm not saying you're not talented," Quincy said. "I'm saying you are so talented that you are terrified of what happens if you actually use it. Because if you use it, all of it, and it fails, then you have nothing left to blame. You can't say you held back." He paused. "That's the real reason you keep going back to that voice. It's not habit, it's insurance." Michael raised his head. He looked at Quincy directly, and the braced expression had shifted, gone, replaced by something harder and more interior, the look of a person being handed a mirror they had been avoiding for years. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "Quiet? Not defeated. I want you to sing the song the way you hear it at 3 in the morning, when nobody is watching. Not the way you think it should sound. Not the way your father would want it to sound. The way it sounds when it's only yours." Michael was still. Then he stood up, picked up his jacket, and went back through the soundproofed door without another word. Gerald looked at Quincy. Quincy picked up his pen, turned the legal pad back over, and wrote 2 words on it, underlining them once. Gerald would spend the next 20 minutes wondering what they were. He would not find out until much later, and when he did, it would reframe everything he thought he understood about what happened that night. The first 3 takes after the conversation were worse than anything that had come before. Technically clean. Michael's voice was always technically clean, but tighter, more controlled, as if the conversation had made the walls higher instead of lower. Gerald kept his hands away from the intercom. Quincy did not press the button. He sat completely still and listened, and his stillness was its own kind of communication. "I am not stopping this. I am not rescuing you. You have to find it yourself." The 4th take started the same way. The count-in, the opening bars, the first line, delivered cleanly, safely, correctly. Gerald watched the levels. Quincy's pen was moving, and then it stopped. Not the tape, the pen. Quincy's hand went still on the legal pad, and his head came up from his notes, and he turned to look through the glass at the booth, and his expression changed in a way that Gerald had never seen on his face before in 6 weeks of sessions. Not satisfaction, not excitement, but a quieter and more absolute state. The expression of a man recognizing what he has been searching for long enough that he had almost stopped believing it existed. Michael's voice had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to in the waveform and say, "There, that exact millisecond." It was more like a pressure releasing. The difference between a fist and an open hand. Lower, fuller, with more air in it. A sound that felt less like a performance and more like a fact. There is a thing that happens in recording studios not often, where a voice stops demonstrating what it can do and starts simply being what it is. Gerald would later describe it as the moment he understood what the word natural actually meant when applied to a singing voice. Not untrained, not raw, but inevitable. As if the sound had always existed exactly this way and had simply been waiting for the moment when no one was holding it back. In the 2nd verse, Michael's voice caught slightly on a word, a roughness on the upper register, technically imperfect. Gerald's hand moved toward the talkback button to flag it. Quincy's hand came down flat on Gerald's wrist. "Don't." Gerald's hand went still. The take continued. When it ended, the control room held 10 seconds of silence. Gerald counted them. He would count them again in the retelling for the rest of his life. Because the length of that silence mattered. It was not the brief pause before a producer reaches for the button. Not the uncomfortable quiet of an unsuccessful take. It was the silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that takes a moment to land. Quincy pressed the intercom. "Come out." Michael came through the door slightly out of breath. eyes already moving, reading the room before committing to an expression. He checked Gerald first. Gerald's face told him what he needed to know, but not yet how to feel about it. Then he looked at Quincy. Quincy held out the legal pad across the table. On it, underlined twice in heavy black ink, were two words, I's voice. Michael studied the pad for a long moment. Then he raised his eyes to Quincy. Then, and this is the detail Gerald always returned to when he told this story, the detail he said no amount of retelling ever made feel less surprising. Michael laughed. Not a performance laugh, not relief. A short, involuntary sound. The kind that escapes before you can decide whether to let it out. The laugh of someone who has just understood a thing that had been staring them in the face for months. He pressed his hand over his mouth almost immediately, as if catching it. Quincy did not smile. He regarded Michael with the steady expression of a man who has confirmed what he already knew. 30 minutes, he said. Then we go again. Michael nodded and walked to the hallway. Gerald heard the exterior door open and close. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what it does in October at midnight. Cool, still, the jasmine from somewhere up the hill, the distant friction of the boulevard. Michael stood on the sidewalk for 22 minutes. Gerald could see him through the small window above the emergency exit. Not pacing, not on the phone, not doing anything at all. Just standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at a fixed point above the roofline. The specific, private expression of a person sorting through a truth that language hadn't caught up to yet. Gerald has been asked many times what Michael was thinking about in those 22 minutes. He always says he doesn't know. His theory, not the song. But every rehearsal survived by making himself smaller than he was. And the realization, at midnight on a sidewalk, that the armor had cost him something he was only now beginning to measure. When Michael came back inside, he went straight to the booth. No detour, no delay. He put on the headphones and looked through the glass at Gerald. Then he turned slightly toward the intercom, not pressing it, just close enough that Quincy could see him. Quincy leaned forward and pressed the talkback button. His voice came through the monitor speaker, quiet and even. Whenever you're ready, Michael. Michael closed his eyes. He gave one nod. Gerald pressed record. What came out of that booth over the next 4 hours was not a performance. That is the word Gerald has always refused. A performance implies someone deciding how to present themselves. What Michael did was closer to what happens when someone stops translating and starts speaking in their first language. The difference not in the words, but in the weight behind them. Take after take, Quincy barely touched his pen. In 11 years behind that glass, Gerald could count on one hand the times he had understood, in real time, that what he was hearing would not come around again. This was one of those times. Then, somewhere in the third hour, Michael did something Gerald had never seen in 6 weeks. He stopped mid-take, not because anything went wrong, but because everything went right. He pressed the talkback from inside the booth. Play that back. Quincy raised an eyebrow. Engineers played back at the producer's instruction, not the artist's. Quincy said, play it back. Gerald played it back. Michael stood listening with his eyes open, head slightly tilted. Not satisfaction, but assessment. A craftsman hearing his own work from the outside. When it ended, he put the headphones back on and nodded. Gerald pressed record. At some point past midnight, Quincy stood and walked to the glass. He looked through it at Michael, eyes closed, one hand pressing the headphone cup against his ear, the other curled at his chest, the tendons in his forearm visible even from the control room. Gerald had noticed that Quincy had barely spoken for the last 2 hours. Not restless, not dissatisfied, simply present in a way that felt different from the focused attention of earlier takes, as if he had stopped producing and started witnessing. Then he turned to Gerald. You know what the difference is, he said, between a good singer and a great one? Gerald shook his head. A good singer gives you what you expect, Quincy said. A great one gives you something you didn't know you needed. He turned back to the glass. His voice, when he said the next part, was quieter. "We've got a great one." Gerald would carry that sentence for the rest of his career, said quietly to a recording engineer, while the subject of it stood 20 feet away with his eyes closed. For years he never knew how to explain that the record people asked about had almost not existed this way. 6 weeks of a parallel version where Michael was technically perfect and emotionally absent, the album on course to be very good and nothing more. The difference between that record and the one that came out is a single conversation. A legal pad turned face down. A fourth take, the album sold over 20 million copies and earned Michael his first solo Grammy. Critics used words like arrival, accurate, and incomplete. What Gerald understood from the inside, it hadn't happened on the release date or in the mixing. It had happened in a single fourth take, in the 30 seconds between the count-in and the instant Michael's voice stopped being careful. But only 2 people were in that control room when it began. When the armor came off, when Quincy's pen stopped moving, when Gerald counted 10 seconds of silence, and a man who had spent his entire life being extraordinary finally allowed himself to be that without anything held in reserve. That night, Quincy drove home along Sunset Boulevard with the rough mix in the car. He listened twice through, pulled into his driveway, sat with the windows down, played the last track one more time. Then he went inside, walked to his piano without turning on the lights, and sat with his hands in his lap. He already knew what came next, had known the shape of it for 30 years. The specific songs, the sounds, the scale were still ahead, but the essential material he had heard tonight, through a pane of studio glass, in a voice that had finally stopped protecting itself. What he was sitting with was not excitement. It was older and quieter, the feeling of a person who has found what they were looking for and must now live with the weight of knowing. 2 months later, the final mix was done. Michael stood in a different studio, arms at his sides, eyes closed, and listened through. When it ended, the room was quiet. He opened his eyes. His gaze settled on no one in particular. Then he said, "We have to do something better." Everyone stared at him. "Not this one," he said quickly. "This one is right. I mean the next one. We have to make a record better than this. Because now I know how to do it." Quincy was standing in the corner with his arms folded. He held Michael's gaze. Then, for the second time since the beginning of those sessions, he smiled. A real smile, not a professional one. "Yeah," he said, "we do." The record they were talking about took 4 years. It sold 66 million copies, the best-selling album in history, and produced a live television performance that stopped conversations in living rooms the instant it came on screen. But here is the thing almost nobody says. Thriller could not have existed without that conversation 6 weeks into the off-the-wall sessions, when Quincy turned a legal pad face down and told a 19-year-old that the voice he had been protecting was the only thing standing between him and everything he was capable of. One conversation, one fourth take, one single nod through a pane of studio glass. Some say great records happen because of talent, craft, timing, luck, all true. But Gerald, who was there, who counted the silence, has a simpler answer. It started, he says, when he stopped being afraid of himself. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. The movie comes out this month. Every studio scene, every quiet decision Jafar plays on screen, it traces back to a night almost no one documented, in a room that no longer looks the way it did. If you think about that fourth take when you watch the film, tell me in the comments, because that instant, more than any other, is the one I keep coming back to.